Over to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you very much. Dina, thank you to the previous panelists in session, which was extremely interesting and useful, and sets a very good grounding for the session that we're about to have. So for people who are listening to this at a later date, I encourage you to look up the previous panel to this one for a lot of incredibly useful information on how to think about the plastics challenge. In this session, I am joined by my colleague and former PhD candidate, Dr. Adebayo Majekolagbe, who will in fact be speaking first, but let me do a little bit of introduction and share our slides. The session that we are hosting right now is going to bring together two particular bodies of work, and we're hoping to, between ourselves, have a rich conversation about how they're related and how we might think they inform potential solutions to the plastics challenge at the plastics climate intersect. So Bio will be beginning first with reflecting on his PhD work on just transition in a climate context, how it needs to be rethought, reframed. And then in the second part, I will be sharing some key lessons from some training materials that I developed on behalf of Dalhousie and the UN Environment Program, and in particular, Sea Circular, a project called Reducing Marine Litter by Addressing the Management of the Plastic Value Chain in Southeast Asia. And this was implemented by UNEP and COBSEA, the coordinating body of the seas of East Asia, with funding support from the government of Sweden. So let me share our slides. I'm assuming that's working. Okay. And as I said, our plan then, after my brief introduction, is to turn things over to Bio, who will talk about just transition and transformation. I'll then share the learnings from the trainings, and we'll have some questions and discussion. So over to you,
Bio. Thank you, Sarah. I just want to be sure that I'm audible enough. Okay, let's do this. Okay. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to everyone who is still here. The last panel was fascinating. I learned a lot, and thank you, particularly Scott's concluding line that the story about laptop being used as a chopping board cracked me up particularly. And in many ways, one of the bigger questions I have, even as I think about just transitions in plastics, one of the bigger questions is, how do we ensure that the laptop of just transition does not become a chopping board? And framed in another way, the question is, just transitions, is just transition even fitting for the plastics context? Or is it just a given that, given the connection between plastics and fossil fuels, just transition is an apt conversation? Another question is, inherent in the term transition is moving from a thing to another thing, or moving from an era, moving from an epoch into another epoch. So what replaces petroplastics? Bioplastics? But what then are the justice implications of bioplastics? And Dr. Bani Pedi teed that question, teed it up really well. What are we moving from? We know what we are moving from, but towards what are we moving? And what would be the justice implications if we were moving from petroplastics to bioplastics? What would be the implication of what we are moving towards. Another question I've been thinking about is, Dr. Emese in the previous panel actually spoke to the issue of power. Where are plastics produced? Who are the major producers? Benefits of transiting from one type of plastics to another type of plastics, or moving away from plastics generally, who benefits from that? And the question of benefits and gain, losers and gainers, that's an essential part of the questions that Just Transition Scholarship seeks to answer. I've got other questions like, where do we engage this from? Is the problem, how do we frame the problem? Is the problem plastics writ large or plastic pollution? And I do not think that is a 6 and half a dozen conversation. I think it goes to where we deal with that problem from. Is it an entirely upstream problem? In which case you could say that the problem is plastics or are plastics. Or is it a downstream problem? In which case you could say, okay, it's plastic pollution, and that's what we should be dealing with. And the last question is, I'm Nigerian, and as a Nigerian, I should know the difference between banana and plantain, although they look alike. And banana and plantain conversation, how does that tie into this? The fact, and I hinted at this previously, that yes, plastics is tied to fossil fuels, but the just transition conversation has been had mostly in the context of fossil fuels. Do we just import that conversation into plastics, or do we begin to investigate important areas of distinctions between plastics and fossil fuels so that we will recalibrate our thinking on how to apply just transitions in the plastics context, in part to avoid what Scott said about laptop being used as chopping board. These are a few of my questions. The questions I've asked myself, even as I try to bring my work in just transition in the fossil fuel context into the plastics context. And perhaps I've tried to game the system such that you have questions to ask when we get to Q&A. But what I will start with is run through the nuts and bolts of just transition. It's a work I've done for about 5 years, and it's something I've been thinking about. Where did it come from? The very concept notion of just transition. Where are we and where should we actually be when we talk about just transition? And I will just run through this in the next 10 minutes, and I look forward to engaging with you on some of these issues afterwards. This quote is from the 2022 Summary for Policymakers by the IPCC, and it's equity and just transitions can enable deep ambitions for accelerated mitigation. Again, this was in the context of fossil fuel-based economy and not explicitly plastics. Can we import the same statements into the plastics context? Or can we just say, can we reframe this as equity and just transitions can enable deep ambitions for accelerated mitigation of plastics or plastics pollution? I don't know, and it's a conversation we can have afterwards. Next slide, please. But just transition is not one thing. There are, and of course, there's been a flurry of work on just transition since 2015, when it's made it into the preamble to the Paris Agreement. And it looks as though just transition is one thing. And that is no thanks to the fact that it emerged from a very narrow context, the labor context. And I will take us through a bit of that history in a bit. But I am inviting you again to look beyond the emphasis on procedure when talking about just transition. Is it just about social dialogue, as just transition scholars would like to frame it? Or is it just about distribution? And that's how we again frame it when we talk about gainers and losers and gains and losses. And okay, we should be able to equitably distribute the losses from the transition or the gains from the transition. But is it just about distribution? Or should we be thinking of something more transformative? And that is the case I will make later on, a case for capability, which which is defined essentially as well-being based. And again, I will come to that. But again, what should just transition entail? Should we just be looking at social justice, or is it socio-ecological, or is it just ecological justice? Is it about the loss of the past, the loss of the present, or that of the future? Or is there a way to bring this together? Or by bringing all of this together, would it become all things to everybody, and it loses a more manageable framing, a more distinct, precise, and perhaps efficient framing? And who are the beneficiaries? Should it just be workers or community? And that's a big bit of my criticism of the dominant narrative around just transition. It is a workers first concept, at least dominantly. That's how it's been engaged with. And tongue in cheek, often I say it's almost like just transition is jobs transition. And that is problematic. And we should pay industry, state, everyone. Should it be a global, and the concept of pay is big in just transition. Workers should not just be let go of in the oil and gas industry. Someone should pay them. If that is a valid framing, then we should pay. And you can export that to the plastics context, particularly in the context of informal workers, pickers and recyclers, mostly in the global south. Of course, there is an argument that you have a big community of informal workers in that sector also in the global north. So we should pay them. And at what point should we address it? Early or later? And you might think that that's a counterintuitive question, and that it should be very obvious that, of course, deal with it early. But that is not how we have dealt with just transition. The international climate regime, if you were to anchor that on the UNFCCC of 1992, has been very, very dull to equity concerns. Of course, there is CBDR, but CBDR is very state-centric, and one would argue that just transition is more at the individual and personal level. So do we deal with it at the earlier, latest, and at what level? Global, national, local, or corporate? And I would run through this, and I would engage further with some of those thoughts. Next slide, please. And I have highlighted some of this in those previous questions. Our just transition is not just one thing, and over time it has become many things, and you just need to check the deluge of literature on just transition. Status quo, just about the workers and exchange of jobs, from gray economy to green economy, or managerial reform. We could touch that up a bit with health and safety at work, or more structural and transformative reform. So far, when you review the laws, legislation, policies, decisions of courts on just transition, we are stuck at managerial reform. Primarily, the exchange of one kind of job for another kind of job, and we have not approached that transformative level, part of which I will describe in a bit. Can we move it, please? And the evolution of just transition, this is not just history for the sake of history. It's not history for the sake of history. It would bring to the fore why just transition has emphasized jobs and work the way it has. And that is because just transition did not begin in the climate change context. It began in the toxic chemical context. And probably that, you could argue, makes it more amenable or more fitting for the plastics conversation, given that it began from that more local, more domestic context, except that some would then argue that plastics is also a very, very global conversation. So it began in the 1980s into the 1990s in the toxic chemical context, led by the labor unions in the United States. Subsequently, Europe joined. Subsequently, Canada joined. And over time, it found its way into climate change lexicon up until 2015, when the International Labour Organization released its guidelines on just transition, which essentially was actually guidelines for green jobs transition. And that framing of green jobs transition, in essence, made it into the Paris Agreement also in 2015. And where we are currently, when it comes to the law of just transition, is almost like the law of jobs transition. Can we move on quickly? Thank you. You would also say that now, this is a 1995 speech by Les Leopold, one of the main thought leaders on just transition in that toxic chemical setting in the 1990s. And this was what Les Leopold emphasized in his speech in 1995. Essentially, we need to replace jobs, we need to retrain workers, we need to relocate workers. Why is this important? It's important because this is also the emphasis today in a different context, in a more global context, in a more drastic and devastating context. And that's what you have in the ILO guidelines, also emphasizing replacing jobs, retraining workers, relocating workers, and of course, added the concept of trilateral social dialogue, which essentially is, let's have a dialogue between the employees, the employers, and the state. And then you wonder, aren't there also other valuable and very important right holders and stakeholders that should be dialogued with, rather than just employees, employers, and the state? But exactly that is the problem with conventional just transition narratives. Conventional just transition narratives begin with workers in its question. So essentially, the answer is in this question. It's simply, what should be just transition for workers and employers? And inevitably, that is what it tries to attend to. That is the problem which, as framed, conventional just transition attempts to respond to. And you will find that in the preamble to the Paris Agreement, and then subsequent declarations like the Solidarity, Just Transition Silesia Declaration, the Glasgow Climate Pact, and more recently, the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan. I should note that Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan went a bit further to begin to speak to issues like poverty and just transition, which is an important framing for the plastics context. But again, it is a footnote, at best, at least essentially a footnote, and not the core of the conversation. More recently, we have, in the more explicit context of plastics, the Zero Draft on a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, which has the section on just transition. And I found it quite intriguing, except that although it began well by talking about engagement for relevant stakeholders, non-governmental organizations, local communities, which purport to frame just transition in a broader way, then you look at from paragraphs B to G, and it's all job-centric. In other words, this instrument is not reframing, it's importing almost entirely that conventional framing of just transition and it's focused on jobs transition. And again, you ask yourself, as Scott has inferred the other time, are we using laptops as chopping board? But what is the problem with conventional just transition? You must have gotten the hints from probably my previous conversation that, for one, it focuses on means rather than end. The fact that you are retraining a worker, giving a worker what has been called a golden handshake, payout to workers, or relocating a worker does not mean that the worker will come into well-being, does not mean that communities would come into well-being, does not mean that ecosystems that have been destroyed will come into well-being. It focuses on means rather than end. And it excludes non-fossil workers. This is one of the areas of distinction between how we've dealt with it in the broader oil and gas and coal context and what I'm beginning to see in the plastics context. Because in the plastics context, informal workers seem to have more influence than organized labor. Organized labor elsewhere in the fossil fuel context, but we are beginning to see informal workers hold sway in the just transition, plastics and just transition context. And I've emphasized how it ancillarily focuses on communities. This hasn't changed. This hasn't changed in the plastics context. I've not seen a lot of focus on communities. But again, that's because that narrative began with emphasis on workers and not from a more broad, from a more holistic context. It's different. There is a world of difference if your question were to be, what does the transition mean for justice for the community? As against when your question were to be, what does the transition mean for workers? Your answers will be different. And generally, conventional just transition does not address past injustices. It tries to just move on into the future, forgetting the past and probably the present. And then disregards global impact of response measures. Next, please. And I would run through this next few slides, and hopefully we would engage on this. This is the way I am thinking about how just transition should be. And I'm drawing from the works of Amartya Sen on the capability approach to justice. Essentially, Amartya Sen has argued that it makes a difference if your analysis is about the means of living rather than the quality of livelihood. And that the focus of justice should not just be about the means of living, it should be about the kind of lives that people are able to live. Martha Nussbaum took it further, and she had those 10 central human capabilities, well-being, that we should aim for. Life, bodily health, family, friendship, healthy environment. And I have regrouped this into personal, social, relational, and environmental. So rather than asking a very narrow question of what does the transition mean for workers, it's more important to ask the question, what does the transition mean for well-being? And what does well-being mean? At least it should mean personal well-being, social well-being, relational well-being, and environmental well-being. And although the language of human rights might be very limited, it is important, nevertheless important, to operationalizing this capability approach. What does that mean if you were to break this into principles? For one, it means that the central objective of just transition should not just be jobs transition, it should be capabilities for well-being. It should attend to existing injustices. It should just not be locally scoped. We must globally scope our framing or scoping of the vulnerable. And when we talk about the procedural aspect of things, it should not just be tripartite, it should be multipartite. And you framing it as a well-being concern would inform the stakeholders and the right holders involved in just transition. It won't necessarily be the case that workers at the particularly organized labor is the dominant stakeholder in a just transition conversation. And it should also speak to different rights. And we're beginning to see bits of this, whether in Scotland or in the EU, although no country has come close to this holistic well-being framing of just transition. The Scottish Act has reference to environmental justice, climate justice, and that's a bit different from the framings we've had before. The European Parliament made use of the social rights framing, which is quite different from human rights, and it's a conversation we could have. Social rights, just human rights, social rights as used by the European Commission. Next, please. I had previously drawn a line between personal, social, relational, and environmental capabilities as key categories of capabilities for well-being. And these are corresponding rights. And this is just to show the nexus between this well-being framing of just transition and human rights. And you can reflect further, we can reflect further of what this means for transition in the plastics context. Next. And this is the slide I'm happy to come back to. A right to a just transition, and this is flowing from the previous slide on the various framings in international treaties, and how you can connect that to just transition. And these are decisions by courts who were looking at just transition issues, although not explicitly stated, and how these courts have decided that these projects, which are transition-oriented in the renewable energy context, breach basic human rights that could be tied to just transition. The first one, consultation. The second one, also consultation and consent by indigenous people, and how states, responsible agencies, failed to take into consideration just transition considerations. And I think the last slide. Okay, questions and comments. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Bio, for that very comprehensive overview of the just transition challenge in terms of using it as a framing to address plastics, given what we know about its experience in the fossil fuel context, what seems to be missed. We have one question in the chat that I'm just going to note from Elena Briones Alonso about the need to prioritize the most vulnerable. Who are these, and how do we determine this? Martha Nussbaum might argue that non-humans are the most vulnerable on almost all dimensions. How can we translate this principle into practical action, policy choices, and priorities? And I'm going to suggest that hopefully my presentation might help partly to answer that, maybe, but not in full. Bio, any reflections at this point? Whoops, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Elena. And you are right. The framing of the vulnerable, how to scope that, is probably, you won't say that Martha Nussbaum's work is the most helpful. More so, you look at the conversation between herself and Amartya Sen on what should be major capabilities. But again, we then fall back to the apt yet imperfect language of human rights. Apt but imperfect, I must emphasize. And probably instruments like human rights impact assessment and instruments like human rights due diligence could help us cope in particular situations who are the most vulnerable, because it must be a very place-based determination. So the simple answer to a very complex question, which we might engage with later on, is can we look at these tools, impact assessment, due diligence, and take a very place-based approach to determining who are the most vulnerable per sector, per place, and per space. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's an additional comment that we appear all vulnerable, which I think we would all agree with, and yet differentially vulnerable at the same time. Dina.
Yeah.
So, I mean, first of all, thank you for a fantastic presentation. I sort of wish we had made it in some ways the starting keynote of the summer school, because it expresses so much of what the kind of issues are in the summer school more broadly. And I really loved your comment about, or you put it in a slide, about the kind of definitional headache. It does feel headache inducing in some ways. But I guess I wanted to ask like a provoking question, which is just like, are you underestimating the kind of significance and space of like labor and workers and what that means in a just transition? Your implication is that we've kind of limited it to the space of labor and workers. But it seems to me in so many ways that the way so much of our lives and our economy and our world is structured is around work, right? Like we all are in various ways workers, but also we're kind of doing more and more and more to recognize the kind of labors and work of those who've kind of conventionally been outside of what the formal economy has recognized as sort of employer-employee kind of relationships. So is it possible that there's space in the conventional conception of just transition for that to be a much more expansive approach, actually, when you think about the ways in which our lives are so intertwined with work? If we revisit ideas of labor rather than revisiting ideas of just transition.
Thank you so much, Dina. Kind remarks. I'm grateful. I was so tempted to pass this along directly to Sarah. She's done very, very important work on the very idea of the reification of labor. And I will go further to say the dehumanization of workers as just workers. The problem with the conventional framing of just transition, it is not that it focuses on work per se, but that it makes it its starting point, and often the solution it poses just speak to the aspect of this very complex entity called human being, but focuses on that minute, I must say, aspect called work or jobs. So the argument is that, can we rethink the starting point? When we rethink the starting point of analysis and we reframe the question, that is it a question essentially about jobs, or is it a question essentially about well-being, of which jobs is a component, you might argue an important component, but in all situations, it won't be the most important. It won't be the most important component in every situation. It might be in some, but we will not know if the conversation always starts with jobs and workers and labor at the very core. And whether it then takes us to rethinking labor more generally, hopefully at the more substructural level, it should. But at this more superstructural level of talking about just transition, perhaps we need to reframe the question. Is it a question about well-being? Which will then help us to attend to the worker as an entire being, a worker as a family person, probably, a worker as a friend, a worker as a member of a community. you often do not get to more nuanced and deeper parts of the identity of a worker if you just focus first of all on jobs. Again, Sarah would have better thought on that and would frame it more brilliantly, but I hope I've probably teed her up to do that well.
I think you did a nice job on that bio. My short version would be maybe it's not work, but sustainable livelihoods that should be the focus. And if we stop talking about everything in terms of work, it might change how we think about it. But I will say, thinking holistically about humans as embedded in social relationships as well as ecological relationships, yet all being differentially situated as at a starting point, is a really important piece of the conversation. I'm going to move on to give an overview of these trainings and draw some lessons from these trainings that I, with a team of researchers at Dalhousie, developed in support of the Sea Circular project with funding through the UN Environment Program. These trainings are available online, so I don't need to do the deep dive here, because you can access all of these materials and they're linked from, I think, a blog post that we linked on the GNHRE website, as well as a couple of direct links. But what I want to do here is to provide just a fairly quick overview of some of the key things and where this has led me to thinking about the climate plastics questions, transition, transformation, and of course, human rights. To start with, I note that the way UNEP has been framing this, and I think correctly, the sort of societies in which we are embedded, and I say we, conscious self, say the consumer society that much of the world is embedded in, is one that very much adopts what they're calling a take, make, waste approach. And we see this very much in the problem of plastics. A very important report that we reference in our trainings was put out by the Special Rapporteur on Toxic Substances and Human Rights, examining the stages of the plastic cycle and their impacts on human rights. And this is from July 2021. Now, this report builds on a lot of other work, background work that had been looking at environmental justice issues in relation to plastics, and importantly, builds and draws conclusions from the incomplete scientific information that is available in the background. So decision makers can only make decisions based on the information that's available, and if scientific studies haven't been conducted on a lot of different things, including the impacts of different types of plastics on human health, then we're having very incomplete conversations. And I'll put that aside for the moment, but just note that as of 2021 in July, the Special Rapporteur suggested that if we want to look at the plastics life cycle, the linear fossil fuel-based take, make, waste plastic life cycle, there are human rights implications at each stage. And so if we're thinking about the purchase of virgin plastics that are derived from fossil fuels, the first place where there are human rights implications is at the extraction stage. And so we need to link that into our conversations about plastics, not see it as separate from it. And that brings with it, of course, all of the climate emissions questions and a lot more. But there are implications at each stage. So petrochemical manufacturing, transportation, whether it's of fossil fuels through pipelines or on trains, whether it's plastic pellets through ships, the use, consumption, and waste generation stage. What are the toxins in different kinds of plastic products? Do we even know? Are they, to what extent? There's emerging studies on the implications of certain kinds of plastic use in agricultural systems, for example, consumer products. And then there's the waste management story. So again, we're increasingly hearing the idea that the use of, or the push towards recycling in advanced economies has been one that has sort of shifted the responsibility of dealing with the consequences of plastic products from producers to local governments, municipalities, so as to develop these very elaborate recycling approaches. Yet at the end of the day, globally, only 9% is actually recycled. And the problem, of course, of plastics from rich countries being transported to others, whether legally or illegally, for disposal, often being incinerated or dumped, and the consequences associated with that. So there's the entire, it's really important, I think, to look through the human rights implications at each stage, and to not lose sight of that when one is thinking about plastics. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been huge benefits at different stages. The plastics haven't brought great human rights benefits if we think of the use of them in the medical profession as an example. But anyway, more on that if we have time. What we did in our work was to draw upon many reports of the special rapporteurs of both toxics and human rights and the environment. We also developed the trainings before the UN General Assembly resolution on adopting the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. But we framed them around the idea of a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And we did that partly because the countries in which we were developing these trainings for, and we were developing them for businesses and governments, and I put an emphasis on businesses. Those countries had, in many cases, already had a constitutionalized right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, unlike where I am in Canada, for example. And so if you take a holistic approach, you can, again, drawing on all of these other, the work of various special rapporteurs, one can substantively think of the right as encompassing rights to access clean air, a safe climate, clean water, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, as well as healthy and sustainably produced food, and non-toxic places to live, work, and play. And so I think by including the human link to healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, we start to do a bit of centering on the biodiversity ecosystem part and to sort of overcome the anthropocentric focus of the human rights approach. But substantively, one can't realize those rights without procedural justice. And so drawing on the work of John Knox's framework principles in particular, the training sort of illustrate the different ways in which access to information, public participation, access to justice, freedom of expression, freedom of association, but also space for environmental human rights defenders to do their work, and recognition of Indigenous rights and Indigenous governance, and all of those things holistically are equally important to the substantive rights dimensions. And then finally, the cross-cutting equity and vulnerability piece of the right is to recognize that different groups have different challenges, and some of the vulnerabilities are the result of rights infringements rather than things that are necessarily innate. So it's important to take into account, when seeking solutions, ways in which one can center groups and individuals that are disproportionately impacted and ensure that they can access procedural mechanisms to realize their rights. Another crucially important part, and I note this is recognized in the General Assembly resolution on human rights and the environment, on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, is the business responsibility to respect human rights. So this was also central to the training materials that we developed. The state, of course, has a duty to protect human rights, but businesses also have an independent responsibility to respect human rights. And we should assume that states are not always going to be in compliance with their duties. Therefore, businesses should always assume that they need to be doing extra work to identify rights holders and identify rights issues. And the third piece, of course, is that remedy is an integral part of a rights-based approach drawing on the UN guiding principles. And so without without access to effective remedy, rights holders or human rights are meaningless is the phrase. And so this also must be included in a rights-based approach, drawing on the guiding principles. The UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has put out various guidance tools that can also help to inform how a human rights-based approach involving business can be understood. So clarifications, I would say. The next few slides I'm going to go through quickly, but these are sort of the images that we came out with in terms of thinking about solutions. So this one, and we can, if I were to come back to them, I might change things a little bit. But the first thing is that from a plastics perspective, and I think we can think this through also from a climate perspective if we think of energy as the product, is that any producer must embed human rights and circularity into their policies and management systems. So as they're contemplating what the product is that they are going to be producing, they need to then identify and assess any adverse impacts that might arise from product design. And so if you're thinking about plastics, there's such a wide range of plastic products that are on the market. This, of course, can lead in all kinds of different directions, but it's certainly if you're somebody who is producing plastic packaging, then the first thing you're in this counterintuitive situation where is your product plastic packaging or is it packaging? And if it's packaging, where might that lead you to, or how much packaging? If you are designing a product and can figure out how to use less plastics, how to use different substances, this all, of course, becomes important. So as you identify the impacts, redesigning your product so you can cease, prevent, or mitigate adverse impacts becomes crucially important, tracking and implementing results, but then continually revisiting each of these stages again. This should be just part of all product design, not just an exceptional thing. But if we're serious about human rights and circularity, then I think this is an important component. A second piece that's really important in the plastic conversation is to address the waste management and disposal aspect. And so when we're thinking of plastics, it is hugely important to distinguish the informal waste pickers who are in a very different situation from, for example, the fossil fuel-based worker in a developed country. If you're thinking sort of in the climate transition context. So there's a lot sort of, again, that can go into this, but as one is designing waste management and disposal systems, again, embedding human rights and circularity is hugely important. Identifying those who will be impacted by the decisions that are made is hugely important. Consulting with rights holders so as to cease, prevent, or mitigate the adverse impacts is equally important. And again, tracking implementation and results and doing this again and again. The final piece goes back to this remedy point. And I think in both the climate and the plastics context, not enough attention has gone to remedy. So we do know from much increasing climate litigation, greater attention to loss and damage in the climate regime, although still quite minimal, and a lack of financing for it. Things like the National Inquiry on Climate Change from the Philippines Commission on Human Rights, that surely those actors that cause harm have a responsibility to not just prevent and mitigate, but also to remedy those harms. This is a fundamental piece of the guiding principles on business and human rights. And the image on the side is to illustrate how the responsibility shifts depending on whether an industry player is understood as having caused the harm, contributed to the harm, or is directly linked to the harm. But all of them, irrespective of what it is, there is a responsibility to try to address the harms. And whether this is seeking a different supplier, for example, or using leverage to try to address harms, or cooperating in remedy. This is, in theory, what should be part of a human rights-based approach that is informed by a business and human rights-based approach. But I think if we go back to the transition and transformation conversation, the remedy aspect and what I think bio, or at least I've certainly referred to at times as the sort of injustice of the starting point, seems to be missing. And I think this is something we're going to hear more about in the plastics context, but it is not something that's evident in, for example, the draft treaty at this point. So that's where I'm ending my presentation, and I know we don't have very much time left. I do think, I hope, that there are possibly lessons from the work that we have done, and again, that was just a little snapshot, for transformation and transition at the Climate Plastics Nexus. Comments, questions at this point? I will actually, in light of time, also just move to this, which was essentially the final slide, but puts these two kind of questions at the center so we can see if there's time for any reflection. So first, my question is there transformative potential in the adoption of a human rights-based approach to production and consumption? So producer responsibilities for product life cycles and circular or even regenerative design. And then secondly, is remedy for past harms an essential component of transformation beyond or as part of just transition? And I'll stop there. I haven't seen any additional questions in the chat. So over to the audience for questions, comments, and also to Bio if he has any reflections. Dina.
Sorry, I'm aware that my dogs have input in the background. Sorry about that. I wonder about bringing these two parts together. So thinking about like well-being approaches, sorry, and business obligations. I'm very sorry. I'm going to stop talking for a second. But sort of thinking about how we think about well-being and humanness, kind of complete humanness in relation to business obligations, and whether that's kind of integrated into what you're saying now, or is that a kind of further step down the road, and whether there's something sort of compromising there.
Certainly, I would say from the, again, this was the snapshot of the trainings, but certainly the aim of the trainings very much is to draw well-being of a wide range of communities into focus at each stage, again, of the plastic cycle. But there is clearly much more work to be done, I think, in ensuring that that's integrated into approaches that are taken to plastics. And it's very tricky. For example, two quick examples. We worked with partners in the region also to develop certain case studies. And so as an example, in one case study, a tofu factory had been burning plastics for fuel because they didn't have access to energy otherwise. And once they realized what the impacts of that were on local health and ecology, they shifted. But they shifted to burning wood because that was what they could access. So we can reflect on what does that say. Another case study involved the challenges associated with what are often referred to as, I'm losing the plastic sachet economy. So producers have been making available to poorer consumers products in smaller and smaller little sachet packages, which are then easy for people to buy. So laundry detergent, for example, buy it every day in a tiny amount, rather than buying a larger amount in a container that's easier to recycle because that's more expensive and inaccessible. But these plastic sachets then have huge implications, are unrecyclable, even if there was a system to collect them, and so on. And then the final example I would just give is if we think of all of the efforts that are going into creating livelihoods or supporting, enabling livelihoods in the recycling context. Has anybody done the studies to ensure that the products that are then being created from this recycled material aren't themselves toxic? Because this is a huge concern that recycling may actually sometimes condense the toxicity of some of the substances. So how again can this help address those concerns? There's a lot of work to be done. We're at 1 minute. Bio, did you want to add a final reflection? I think for us, this is perhaps the beginning of a conversation, and one that I think is very important that I hope we're going to take on. So I want to thank Bio for indulging me and sharing his work, which I think is hugely important to future steps. Bio.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, and I'm grateful for your contribution to that work, which is still ongoing. A quick comment on Dina's question on the connection between well-being and just transition in the plastics context. Who leads the conversation matters. I have permit the use of the word problem when OECD leads the conversation. I just did a quick search through another quick search through the guidelines on for multinationals and responsible business conduct, and there is not one mention of well-being. That is in spite of another body of work by the OECD on well-being. So who leads the conversation? And we need to be very clear-eyed on the direction the conversation would go, depending on who leads the conversation. Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you. We're at time, so I'm going to say thank you very much. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to Tobias. Those were really fantastic presentations. A really good kind of summing up to the first day of the summer school. And this conversation sort of carries on in a way tomorrow. Our first session at 8 a.m. Europe time is changing corporate behavior and mechanisms for seeking stronger climate change and human rights due diligence systems within business. So it very much picks up on some of the issues that we've started talking about here. So come back, join that meeting tomorrow. Thank you for the presentations. Just to quote one of the comments in the chat, brilliant presentations. And thank you to our audience for being here, for your comments and your questions. See you all tomorrow.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and to Dina for hosting. And thank you.